Hello and welcome to another episode of Faces of the MRM. I'm here with X Man, good friend of mine I know from the National Coalition for Men. X Man, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. So happy to have you on. So you just said something very interesting, which I want to start off with. You say that you call yourself an advocate for men
Hmm.
rather than a men's rights activist.
Right.
Could you explain the distinction?
Well, no, I mean, I think the men's rights activism implies that you're part of a movement, the men's rights movement. I'm just an advocate. I'm just an advocate for men in general. Like, um, I'm willing to work with pretty much any movement or any group that actively wants to talk about men's issues and has any interest in fixing men's issues.
Right. And so what are some of the men's issues in particular are you most concerned about or do you talk about?
Well, one of my main things would be a big gap in prison sentencing because that's a major one. And I noticed that the gender gap in prison sentencing is just as big as the racial gap, if not bigger. So, and it's interesting because if someone tells you that there's a racial gap, a racial sentencing gap, then everyone would be like outraged about it. But if you say it's a gender sentencing gap, everybody would try to justify it and say, oh, it's because men are more violent, or because or because men just commit too many crimes, so we have to give them longer sentences. Um, and that normalization is a problem. I also don't like the idea of men being forced to sign up for selective service. That's always been a big one for me. And the third most important thing for me would be men's health, because I don't think men's health get enough recognition or funding. And I think a lot of men's lives could be saved if more people focus on their health and more people bring attention to it.
Yeah, when you said people would, when you talk about the gender gap when it comes to prison sentencing, once you mention something is a man's issue, people will do anything to rationalize it.
Yeah,
And I just saw something on Reddit where now it's coming out that all of the people who were killed in that fire at that migrant center were men. All of a sudden, everybody's justifying the fact that the guards basically let them burn to death.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you see the male empathy gap kind of everywhere.
yeah. I mean, when I tell people, a lot of people talk about there's a long study about violence against women, and it's not much study about violence against men. And people's excuse would be, well, okay, well, because what people tell you that more women die, but then that's not true. More men actually get murdered and killed than women. And then they'll try to justify and say, oh, it's because of other men killing them. Okay, but do you know that women also kill men, more likely to kill men than they are to kill other women? So whether it's a male or female perpetrator, both sides are still likely to kill more men than they are to kill other women. So
Yeah, it's kind of similar how the Duluth model is always brought up when it comes to domestic violence, and they say,
right,
well, the root cause of domestic violence are men's power dynamic over women, and yet, and I don't mean this is in any kind of criticism towards the LGBT community, but the couple most likely to experience domestic violence in the U.S. is a lesbian couple,
lesbian, right.
a
Mhm.
couple of two women. So how does the male power dynamic play into that? You know, so what kind of led you down the road of discovering that there's a need for advocacy for men in the first place?
Well, I've been an advocate for a bunch of other issues prior to that. I was an advocate for Black issues first, and I was an advocate for women's issues. And um, I've always noticed small like double standards towards men throughout history, but I never like sat there and put two and two together and said and realized there was a list, like I can go down a list. I never thought about that. Like once every blue moon, I recognized stuff growing up about like the double standards of female violence versus male violence, or women hitting girls hitting boys versus boys hitting girls. I've noticed the double standards about empathy towards men and women, but I never actually sat back and you know and said, oh, there's a whole list. There's a whole list of double standards towards men. I never sat back and thought about that. My entire life has just been it's just been me thinking that all of these things were natural or normal things, or me trying to rationalize it in my head why these things existed. But over time, being an advocate and saying that the entire energy that activists always push is that injustice won't stand, that injustice is not okay, and that there's no excuse for it. And to see when people bring up double standards towards men, people are like, oh, well, there's a justification for that. There's a reason for that. And people go from saying injustice won't stand to, well, this injustice can stand for now, or it's not that big of a deal, or uh, or there's a reasoning for it, and that caught my attention. I said, well, there needs to be somebody or some people advocating for men to fix that.
So interesting. You said that you were a woman's activist before you were a men's activist.
Yes,
At that time, would you identify as a feminist?
yes. Unfortunately, my Twitter account got banned, but when I was originally my first year on Twitter, I was actually openly advocating for feminist groups. I was under the assumption that feminism was just misunderstood, um, and that it was just some group about women's issues. Because again, at that point, I never thought about men's issues even being a thing altogether. And I tried to promote feminism and men's issues together. I thought maybe they weren't mutually exclusive, but everywhere I went, they made it 100% true that it is mutually exclusive, that you can't talk about it. You can't talk about it and still advocate for feminism. You can't advocate for men's issues. You can't try to push legal issues and still advocate for feminism. So they made that 100% clear. And that's why I slowly went away from the feminist movement and said, okay, I got to do my own thing to talk about men's issues. I'm still going to I'm still going to advocate for women, because I don't feel the need to, have animosity and be like, oh, well, now women don't deserve rights. I don't feel the need to do that. Um, but I'm mostly going to advocate for men right now because there's not a big enough movement or a big enough push for those issues to be fixed.
So interesting. You were basically told that you tried to be both a feminist and someone who also cared about men's rights, and you were
Right.
told, no, you can't do that.
Yes.
So what's interesting, I always hate it when videos in the men's rights movement or men's movement or advocating for men ends up talking about feminism in a critical way, because
Hmm.
we're often accused of being anti-feminist more than advocates for men.
Hmm.
But people like you are very, very common, and you kind of prove a point that when we talk about men's issues, we get conflict from feminists. We don't
Hmm.
go out trying to find this conflict just happens. So you, in fact, tried to make both work amicably, and you were told no.
Right.
So that I think to me says a lot, because nobody in any kind of men's movement, maybe not like the red pill, but I
Hmm.
don't see that as a legitimate part of what we are, would stop you from advocating for women's rights. Like
Right.
you say you still talk about women's rights now.
Yeah. I openly tell people that.
Have you ever had an MRA or a men's advocate tell you shouldn't do that?
No.
It kind of speaks for itself. And what's interesting is your story is parallel a little bit to Cassie J,
Hmm.
who made
Right.
who made the Red Pill documentary. And I just have to make a note, if you're just getting into this channel for the first time, Cassie J is a documentary filmmaker who made a documentary about the men's rights movement called The Red Pill. Now, even though the Red Pill is in the name of the documentary, it is not the same thing as the Red Pill movement. What's interesting is that Cassie J went into this project as a feminist, expecting to denounce the men's movement. She was expecting to find a hateful movement. And by the end of the movie, she actually changed her mind. By the end of the filming process, she actually changed her mind. So you kind of had something similar.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, like I said, in my scenario, I originally didn't know anything about men's issues altogether. So I was a feminist because I was just advocating for women. When I advocate for Black issues, I joined with the civil rights groups. I became a supporter of civil rights movement because that's the main group affiliated with Black issues, right? So feminism is the main group usually affiliated with women's issues. So that's why I became a feminist. I never did any like deep research about their stance on men's issues, and I didn't even know there was a whole stance on men's issues altogether. So to be fair, I don't know whether or not I would have been a feminist had I known that. But
Right.
yeah.
Right. Was it kind of unsettling or disjarring to kind of come across this realization that what you had thought before was kind of the opposite?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is kind of jarring when the group of people that you're affiliated with, when it's jarring when a group of people who are supposed to be activists behave like bigots. There's a problem, You expect bigots to behave like bigots. You expect activists to behave like activists. You don't expect activists to behave like bigots. You expect them to repeat bigoted talking points to people you use to stop other demographics from succeeding or from progress. Like, but so yeah, that really did catch me off guard.
So how do you see the relationship and the I hate to use this term intersectionality between the men's movements, men's advocacy, and Black advocacy? What needs to improve? What do you think the dynamic is? Do you think there's a kind of distrust between them, or do you think it's kind of starting to merge together? Do you think there's Black men who are kind of starting to say, hey, you know, something's not totally right here?
I'm under the assumption that most men, especially when they get in their 20s and 30s, they kind of already know these issues, but they don't talk. But they try to talk. They try to find like these alternative ways to talk about it. Because as we see, when they try to talk about it directly, they get backlash, right? Um, so usually, I notice that men usually try to do other professions to try to talk about. Some try to use sitcoms, where you see these sitcoms of these unhappy husbands having to deal with their controlling, abusive wife or nagging wife. You see these stand-up comedians. Most stand-up comedians try to bring it up and try to under the guise of comedy, so they can use comedy as a shield. And I think this is no different. I think Black men pretty much know that. It's just they're trying to use race as like the shield. Like racism is a part of it, but they're trying to use it as the ultimate shield so they don't have to talk about the male aspect of it, right? If you say, they can talk about men being incarcerated at large rates as long as they say it's Black men and as long as they put it under the guise of racism and white supremacy. It gives them that shield where they can talk about it without the constant mainstream backlash.
So you choose, and I think that's fascinating what you said. Um, and I think it's interesting, you choose not to be a part of a movement per se. Do I have that right?
I don't have a problem being part of a movement. I just didn't. Um, I I'm not fully sold on the direction. Me and the MRM are kind of going in different directions. Strategy, we're a little different on strategy, um, but I don't have a problem being a part of any movement per se.
Okay, interesting. What do you think the strategy should look like? Like what direction?
Oh, my strategy has always been the same. Legal is the first one when it comes down to men's issues. Um, only because the thing about social change, and this hurts the ego of activists because activists love to claim that social change is all about their hard work and dedication. But here's the reality. If society is disadvantaging you and putting all these double standards on you, they don't care if you don't like these double standards. They don't care if these double standards inconvenience you. So you being an activist and going on television and saying these double standards don't benefit you. Well, why would they care? They know that. They knew that when they did it, right? It's always the opposing demographic that steps up and takes responsibility and self-reflects and says and acknowledges their privileges and their advantages that allows this to happen. If it wasn't for white allies, the civil rights movement would not have been successful because it existed for it. Most people don't know it existed before MLK. It was another leader before MLK who was a leader of the civil rights movement, and it wasn't successful. And when MLK was a leader, he started around like the 40s. They didn't become successful until like the 60s. Like it took decades. It wasn't just black people banding together and that's it. It White people had to acknowledge their had to self-reflect and acknowledge their problems and acknowledge their how their behavior was affecting people for it to work. And same with women's issues. Same with the LGBT. Right? It's always the opposing demographic that has to step up and it takes a turn of character to step up and acknowledge your privileges to fix the issue. Um, that sounds noble and heroic. I try not to sound very pessimistic, but that I don't know any history where women as a demographic have ever got together and decided and agreed to do that. I don't know this history where women openly agreed to like we shall self-reflect as women on how our behavior affects men. It's usually women denouncing the topic altogether, downplaying the issue or acknowledging the issue, but blaming it on men, saying it's men's fault that they're behaving like this. So I
It
just
is.
don't see.
I will say though, to that point, I will say I do think a lot of women are starting to voice advocacy for men, and there's a lot of women in the men's
Yeah,
rights movement, Cassie J being amongst them. So
right,
I do think we're in a kind of unique time,
sure, yeah,
and I think we are seeing people of all genders look at this and say, hey, you know, I recognize this problem. I can see
yeah,
this. I can see this. I mean, in our NCFM meetings, it's
yeah.
decent gender split, decent gender
Yeah,
ratio.
I just think it's not what I'm saying. I think it's not the, how do I say, it's not the status quo is what I'm saying. It's not the
Right.
status
Right.
quo to do it. Like women today like on average. Like if I have if I put a room of women who agree with men's issues, who want to talk about men's issues and agree with it, versus a room of women who don't, my guess is that if the room of women who don't is going to be just a little larger, is from my experience. Usually when I've seen women who are advocates for men do like speeches or do like speeches on like college campuses or something like that, there's usually way more women on the other side trying to shout them down, say we don't agree with you. Um, so I mean, I would love to believe that this reality where where women are the majority, where those women are the majority, but even if they are, they're at the moment being a silent majority, and that's not very effective. Being silent isn't very effective, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so you think we should approach things legally first? That should be the primary way we address men's issues.
Yes, for two reasons. Yes, the first reason is that, and I tell people this all the time, the history is written by winners. If you like when the more a person succeeds, the more people are likely to listen to them because people in life want to listen. Like if you haven't taken advice from a motivational speaker, you wouldn't take advice from someone who's like who's broke, who's broke or hasn't had any,
Right.
who
Right.
hasn't accomplished, who dropped out of school or who's a criminal, right? You would take advice from someone who's successful, right? People are more likely to listen to successful people. And so my affiliation, and one of the examples I always try to use is the fathers' rights movement, because out of all men's groups, that's the one group that, even though it does still get kind of like backlash, it's the one group that gets the closest to fair coverage out of all men's groups, I've noticed. And I can, if I go on television today and say the word father's rights, it won't. The word father's rights isn't even really a taboo subject. It's saying that's just a natural term. Father's rights lawyers are on television every day advertising for
Right.
commercials to tell people to, right. And the reason they're successful, the reason we've reached that scenario is because the father's rights was legally successful. They actually accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. They kept trying to pass laws. They're passing laws today, getting shared parenting bills passed, and they're currently doing a parental alienation issue. And they took people to court to fight for the fathers to get custody. So so I
Yeah.
was assuming the more MRAs, the more men's groups and other men's groups become successful legally, the more people would have to listen. More people would be more likely to listen to them.
What's
And
really interesting, the kind of the aha moment I just had there, I kind of see there's a psychology to seeing a successful court case, right? I think
right.
most Americans in general trust, or not completely, but most Americans in general, I think, trust our court system. So if they see that a men's rights group won a court case, say in the Supreme Court, then they would be forced to think, there's got to be a reason why they won this court case. There must have
Mhm.
been some legitimacy to the issue.
Right. And
Makes sense.
the second reasoning I wanted was because like I said, the thing about social issues is that, as originally pointed out with other activist groups, social issues you have to wait for the privileged person to agree with you. You have to wait for the privileged group to agree with you, the non-disadvantaged group to agree with you. In this case, and if we're talking about selective service, I can have this I can yell at the top of my lungs, I can cry, I can scream, I can talk rationally, I can behave however I want to and talk about selective service being unfair. But until women universally agree, universally get up to and agree to talk about the issue and self-reflect about how it's a privilege to not have to sign up for selective service, how it's a privilege to not have to sign up for the draft, unless they universally agree with that. You're basically yelling at a wall. We're basically arguing to the thin air. Nothing's happening. No one's going to care until women care about the issue. But if a legal law gets passed, if men were to legally pass a law saying that either the selective service disappears or men and women both have to sign up for selective service, then it's not really asking anybody's permission. You're not really asking, oh, can you do the right thing? You're basically saying this is equality. We both are going to live in an equal nation. It's not really asking for people's permission. You know what I'm saying? If you pass a gender sentencing law saying that men and women should get equal prison sentences, you're not really asking for permission for them to agree with you. It's kind of saying that this is how life is. We're going to be equal. We're going to live in an equal society. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm saying legal accountability. The reason I like legal accountability is because you're not really asking. So you're not really asking the other demographics permission for that accountability. You're making it a reality yourself.
Wow. Yeah. No, I see your point. How would you respond really fast? How would you respond to people who say, um, the male only draft is an example of misogyny because it shows that women aren't taken seriously enough to get drafted? Which,
I usually wouldn't respond to it. Like, what would I give them? Um,
but in all
no,
seriousness, okay, so I like what you're saying, and I get what you're saying. You're not asking for permission, and I like that. I think that MRAs do too much of that. They do too much asking for permission for people to care about an issue that they clearly don't care about.
Mhm.
So if you have an issue that is discriminatory, but it's kind of a social issue, like
Right.
the education gap, boys getting lower grades and also boys getting lower grades for the same work, and then men going to college at lower rates and men graduating high school at lower rates. How would you fix that from a legal approach?
I I do think the teacher one part is partially legal because it is discriminatory for a teacher to give them lower grades. So you'd have to probably take that teacher to court. But as far as the way the students go to college and graduate, that would be more something men could talk to men about. That's more like a one-on-one of men talking to other men about how to perform better, versus um I don't know how to handle there's certain issues I still don't know how to handle certain like double standards related to women hitting men versus versus men hitting women. I don't know how to handle that social double standard, like how to get people to change their opinion on that, or how to people to change their opinion on men crying versus women crying, or stuff. I don't know how to change that per se. I have ideas, but I'm saying I don't know any 100%. It's not as 100% as legal as a legal aspect.
Well, when it comes to hitting people, you could prosecute assault equally.
Yeah,
For
right,
crying, I see what you mean. That would be very tough to do.
right. Sorry. Yeah.
If I were to go after the education gap from a legal approach, maybe I could start with setting up a federal commission to investigate why this gap exists, and then to
Yeah,
investigate if there is a grading bias and if there are teachers giving boys lower grades for the same
right.
work, which you don't see it on the screen. People will see it. I put up a study from the MIT School of Economics, which broke, and I put it in the link in the description below, which broke down grading bias in the US by gender and found
Yeah.
categorically, without question, boys are getting lower grades for the same work.
Oh
I think
wow.
if a teacher is found to be doing that, I think it would be fair to either give them a warning or fire them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, and like I said, as far as the way men are, is there a study about is there some type of bias in the way they're getting men to college or men dropping out, or is that like a performance issue?
I don't know. There are studies that show men are less likely to finish university.
Right.
And there are studies that show men are less likely to finish university, not just in the United States, but Finland, I've seen it, Iceland, I've seen it, Sweden, I've seen it, Korea, I've seen it, the
That's
UK, I've
interesting.
seen it. Yeah. So
That
men
most of the
are,
countries you named were like or ones considered to be like first world countries where there's equality. That's interesting.
well, the University of Helsinki a few years ago declared themselves to be officially feminist, and their male enrollment has never been doing worse ever since. So,
Right. Right. But just to make sure, the only thing I don't want to do, I just don't want to assume, that that was all based off of discrimination towards men or, or a hostile workplace.
oh, totally.
I just want to make sure I want to make sure I get all the facts about that dropout in college enrollment beforehand, just to make sure.
Well, in Finland, there's a study that looked at. I don't know if Finland was looked at in this study because the study was
Hmm.
back. I think this study was looking at Austria, but I'm not 100% sure. Both in Finland and Austria, they have male-only conscription. And there was a
Hmm.
study that showed that conscripting an 18-year-old hurts them down the line in education for several reasons. The
Hmm.
primary one being they're now an extra year removed from their high school studies. So, like the math, the formula, the
Right.
chemistries, it's less fresh in their minds. So, it's more difficult for them to suddenly start a college education again, as opposed to someone who doesn't get conscripted and just goes straight through as normal. But I'm not sure what else, but there were other factors as well. But they did show
Hmm.
that definitively conscription hurts education.
Hmm.
So,
I think another part of activism that people don't like to do is also the what I call individual virtue. That's it's like when you support people to perform better or do things better themselves as well. I think that would also be a good thing because it's also less controversial. If instead of if there's a not a bias, if there's not a bias and men are just not, performing at that level where they're cracking under the pressure, it'd be nice if we, support them, show support, and try to show, encourage more men to try to perform better and not drop out. Um, same thing with, like I said, with men's health. If men's health doesn't get enough recognition, one thing we can do is also we can also try to bring recognition to it, ourselves. It's less controversial if that feels it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I gotta say, X, this was a fantastic interview.
Mhm.
You are, I always say, you're one of the busiest people I know in the movement. You're always writing, you're always working on something. So it's very encouraging and inspiring to see, people like you, like really putting their noses down to the grinder and getting stuff done.
Oh yeah.
So, what's something you've written lately?
The most recent one I've written, you mean for men's issue? Because I write a lot of
Oh
a
yeah, I
lot
know,
of different
for
stuff.
men's issues. Well, whatever you
Okay,
want. Whatever you want to talk about.
no, you're right. No, you're right. For men's issues, the recent one I wrote about was there was a barbershop prank. There was a prank where a barber was cutting men's hair, and after the prank, he would kiss them on the forehead without their knowledge or consent, and he would record their reactions. And it was being praised because people were saying like, oh well, by him kissing other guys, that's him breaking down a barrier. That's him breaking down the barrier of quote unquote toxic masculinity, that he's getting men to be more emotional and more open and et cetera, et cetera. But I had an issue with that because he didn't ask them for their consent prior to this. He was doing it for a prank. He was trying to it's like, and even in like, how do we
Okay.
now in the videos, the several videos he showed, that those men reacted positively, like they just laughed at the situation. But how do we know that there weren't men who reacted negatively and he just cut those parts out? Like how do we like how do we know? Like, do you think he would
And
show
even
it?
so, I mean, even if they did react positively, you didn't have their consent beforehand.
Yeah, yeah.
I
And it's
mean,
like, why would men why are men expected to let other men uh disregard their boundaries in hopes, just so that they can become some symbolic nature of stopping toxic masculinity? Like, doesn't make sense.
yeah.
If anything, when they say toxic masculinity is disrespecting people's boundaries, so when that word makes more sense for the barber, but
It's actually very telling that the same people who think that combating toxic masculinity is important are the same people who are fine and even congratulate violating men's boundaries.
yeah,
Kind of speaks for itself.
exactly.
So, all right, man, this was a great interview. I'm going to put the links I mentioned below. Now, do you have any links that you want me to put down below? Any of the stuff that you've published or anything?
Well, I mean, you can put a link to my website, Humanity
Okay.
87. Yeah, humanity87.home.blog.
Okay.
That's my men's
Awesome.
website. And yeah, that's it.
Okay. Very cool. Have a good one.
You too.